Jessica, also Apple's separate story, Apple playing attack and defense in the patent war, all to do with smartphones. Tell us about this. It seems to be on both sides of it.
Indeed. I mean, for over a year now, Apple's been pretty aggressive in trying to defend the technology around the iPhone, claiming that a lot of phones that run Android are ripping it off. It sued Samsung, it sued HTC, it's fired back against Motorola, which sued it. But you know, we took a look at some of the patents that its competitors are trying to wield against Apple, and there are a few interesting things. Probably the most interesting are these patents that Motorola and Samsung have related to 3G wireless networking. So if you have a phone that runs on a 3G technology, these are patents that cover that, and they're known as sort of standards essential because you need to use them to be part of the 3G standard. So Apple is actually really focused on these patents and tried to make the arguments that Samsung and Motorola are sort of violating their commitments to being part of a standard, which involve a willingness to license these, which Apple says hasn't happened. So those are a pretty critical category of patent to watch in terms of how vulnerable Apple is. And there are many others too. I mean, Motorola has been around, you know, for decades in this space and has a number of patents related to paging technologies like email. And some of those have actually been upheld in Germany, and Apple's had to make some changes there. But it's interesting to look at because the different types of wireless companies, you know, have different types of patents, obviously. You have the much older sort of companies with the legacy technologies from decades ago, and then Apple with basically, you know, the inventions related to the iPhone, which just came out in 2007. And as this plays out in the months and years, I think we're going to see you know, some questioning on the different types of patents and what's valid and what's not. And it's going to be, it'll continue. I don't think this is going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you point out in your piece, I mean, there's just so much litigation right now and threatened litigation across the globe of different wireless companies saying, no, our patents are the ones that matter. Do you have a sense of how this gets settled out?
I mean, most lawyers you speak with will tell you that eventually these things resolve in some kinds of settlements and very broad cross-licensing agreements. They also say that the shape of those settlements determines how bloody you can get your competitor before. So to anticipate a lot more continued sort of battling in the courts, there are some trials set in the coming months for out in California here with Samsung and Apple. That's going to be a high-profile one. So I think in the long term, everyone thinks, or medium term, this will get resolved, but no one's expecting that to happen, you know, tomorrow.
Now, they're also fighting over the way you use your fingers to unlock your phone, right? I mean, the swipe to open. I mean, that seems a pretty interesting one in itself because that seems to be fundamental to a lot of touchscreen phones.
Yeah, it's a great example of a patent that's at a lot of these disputes. I mean, it's something you do. You know, some consumers, you don't buy a phone because of a particular action to unlock it, right? But yet, you know, Apple, one of the patents that it's asserted most frequently and continuously in these cases is that little slide to unlock the phone. And you know, the company feels that it's an important feature because it's when you pick up your phone, you know, one of your first interactions. And it's been very interesting to see other companies come up with their own ways and including there's a stretch to unlock instead of a slide to unlock that some Motorola phones are using, which is very similar. And, you know, I think it just illustrates sort of how these fights are playing out. They're playing out over sort of some core technologies too, but it's this little stuff that companies argue was really important to getting an edge because the market is so competitive. And basically, the companies are also trying to throw all the patents they have in these cases and just find ones that stick. You know, maybe it's slide to unlock, maybe it's spell check. These are the types of things that are in dispute. But slide to unlock is a great example because you do it a bunch of times every day and probably don't think about it. But companies are really fighting to preserve, you know, their individual methods of it.
Obviously, this is a very complicated issue with tons of different things. One of the questions is, how willing are the different players to license? We've seen Microsoft go very aggressively and say, we want to license to the Android makers, and we've seen Apple seemingly doing less licensing. They've licensed in a few cases. How willing do you think Apple is to license these patents if companies are interested?
It's a good question. I mean, the company doesn't obviously talk about that publicly. I mean, our reporting suggests that they are, and that there have been conversations, although all parties sort of will say privately, we are willing, but the other side's not willing. So I guess that boils down to it being hard to tell. But you can tell, I mean, all the court cases will pull up evidence of settlement talks that have happened in past years. So there's obviously constant dialogue, as I think there is in all of these cases. But it is hard to tell. I mean, Apple, we've reported recently that they've just sort of been outraged by some of the terms that Motorola was proposing in terms of licensing. And, you know, if there are big gaps like that, I don't think we'll see it anytime soon. But the fact that sort of repeatedly this notion of talks comes up suggests it'll happen eventually.